June 18, 1812. U.S. President James Madison signs the official declaration of war against Great Britain. It has been precedented by years of tensions, but it will soon become obvious. Neither side is prepared for the realities of war. Almost a month earlier, on May 11, 1812, British Prime Minister Spencer Perceval was assassinated in the lobby of the House of Commons. He becomes the only British Prime Minister ever killed in office. He is succeeded by Robert Jenkinson, the second Earl of Liverpool. He is more pragmatic and moderate than Perceval, and wishes to avoid war with the United States if at all possible. On June 16, 1812, Britain formally repealed the Orders in Council. The ship on its way to deliver the news to Washington passes an American ship on its way to London. It is carrying the United States' formal declaration of war against Great Britain. The British are too late. In 1812, the British Army numbered over 220,000 men, though most were tied down in Europe, with many men in the British homeland, Iberian Peninsula, Mediterranean, and in colonial territories like India and the Caribbean. This meant that in Canada, Britain's forces numbered just 6,000 regulars, forcing them to rely on the poorly trained Canadian militia and their new native allies under Tecumseh, who after the defeat at Tippecanoe had withdrawn to British-held Amherstburg. Overall command of British North America fell to Sir George Prevost. He was in charge of the main force of Lower Canada, numbering 3,000 regulars from Quebec City. To the south, Major General Isaac Brock served as the acting lieutenant governor of Upper Canada. Based out of York, he commanded 1,600 regulars, with an additional 4,000 poorly trained Canadian militia. The U.S. Army, in contrast, was more numerous, but remained scattered and disorganized. General William Hull, the governor of the Michigan Territory, had been newly appointed to command the Northwestern Army, numbering 300 regulars and 2,000 Ohio militia from Fort Detroit. Along the Niagara frontier, General Stephen von Rensselaer commanded the New York militia, containing 200 regulars and 6,000 militiamen. In northern New York, General Henry Dearborn has been appointed by Madison as overall commander of the U.S. Northern Army. He commands about 5,000 regulars and militia scattered from Albany up to Plattsburgh. Along the Indiana and Illinois frontier, the U.S. also has several small garrisons in Fort Dearborn, Fort Wayne, and Fort McKinnock. Madison has planned on a general offensive. Hull's objective will be to cut the British supply line from Amherstburg, while Rensselaer will strike with the New York militia across the Niagara, and Dearborn will attempt an invasion of Lower Canada. But Rensselaer's force is unprepared and unready for action, while Dearborn's force will be delayed until winter, meaning that in July of 1812, only Hull's force will take action. Hull took command of his army at Dayton, Ohio in late May. His force initially consisted of 3 regiments of Ohio militia. He soon found no arrangements had been made to supply them on their march, and the soldiers themselves were poorly equipped and ill-disciplined. forcing him to make hasty efforts to remedy the situation. At Urbana, Ohio, Hull was joined by the 4th Infantry Regiment. From Urbana, Hull would march north, forging a new road to Detroit across the Great Black Swamp of northwestern Ohio. On June 26th, he received a letter from Eustis, who served as Madison's Secretary of War, warning him that war was imminent and urging him that he should make for Detroit with all possible expedition. The letter was dated June 18th. Unknown to Hull, later the same day, Madison had signed the official declaration of war against the United Kingdom. A second letter containing this vital information would not reach Hull until July 2nd. When Hull reached Detroit on July 5th, he was reinforced by several detachments of the Michigan Territory Militia. To Hull, it was obvious the Americans were desperately short of supplies, especially food. Nevertheless, he received constant pressure from Washington to cross the Detroit River and capture Amherstburg. In Upper Canada, Major General Brock had received news of the declaration on June 26th. He immediately sent word to Amherstburg at the mouth of the Detroit River and to the British outpost at St. Joseph Island on Lake Huron. Amherstburg was defended by about 350 British regulars, mainly from the 41st Regiment of Foot, a detachment of the Essex Militia, and roughly 400 indigenous warriors, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Thomas St. George. Nevertheless, on July 12th, Hull crossed into Upper Canada and occupied Sandwich. From there, he issued proclamations, which were intended to induce the inhabitants to either join or support his army, while he commanded several of his mounted troops to raid up the Thames River as far as Moravia Town. These moves discouraged much of the Canadian militia from opposing him, but few actively aided his invasion. Along the Cunard River north of Amherstburg, Hull's scouts engaged in several indecisive skirmishes with British pickets. His forward scouting parties also brought news of the British fort at Amherstburg. Hull soon decided that he could not attack the British fort without artillery, which could not be brought forward from Fort Detroit because the American carriages were in desperate need of repair. Hull's destitute supply situation was further exacerbated by British actions on Lake Huron. News of the war and orders to take Fort McKinnock had reached the British captain Charles Roberts on July 8th. He immediately began assembling a force consisting of 50 British soldiers of the 10th Royal Veteran Battalion, 150 Canadian fur traders, and 410 natives from the Chippewa, Ottawa, Sioux, Menominee, and Winnebago. Fearing that the Native American contingents would disperse if they were not allowed to attack, Roberts set out for Fort McKinnock on July 16th. The American garrison of Fort McKinnock consisted of 61 artillerymen under Lieutenant Porter Hanks. The fort was equipped with 7 cannons, although only one of these, a 9-pounder, could actually reach the harbor. The fort also had several other flaws. The garrison relied on a spring outside the fort for fresh water, and the position was overlooked by a higher ridge less than 1 mile away. On top of that, the Americans had also received no news from Washington and were completely oblivious to the outbreak of war. Early on the morning of July 17th, Roberts' force landed at a settlement 2 miles from the fort. They quietly removed the village's inhabitants from their homes, and dragged a 6-pound cannon through the woods to the ridge above the fort before firing a single shot. The shot took the Americans by complete surprise and was soon accompanied by several messengers under a flag of truce, demanding the surrender of the fort. The flag of truce was escorted by 3 villagers, who greatly exaggerated the size of the British force. Believing he faced overwhelming numbers and fearing a native massacre, Hank surrendered without resistance. The surrender further hurt American control of the Great Lakes, putting added strain on Hull's supply lines and inducing the previously neutral Wyandot, living near Detroit, to become increasingly hostile to the Americans. For Hull, every day the situation grew increasingly dire. Hull's supply lines now stretched for 60 miles along the Detroit River and the shore of Lake Erie, which was firmly under the control of the British Navy, allowing them to cross the lakes at will, making it incredibly vulnerable to British and indigenous raiders. On August 4th, a war party under Tecumseh managed to ambush and rout an American detachment at the Battle of Brownstown, further disrupting the supply line and critically capturing Hull's dispatches, further isolating him from Washington. Hull now faced an increasingly desperate situation. His men, which were already ill-prepared and undersupplied, now risked their entire supply line being cut. He would decide to commit a large party under Lieutenant Colonel James Miller, with orders to clear his lines of communication and escort a supply convoy of 300 head of cattle and 70 pack horses from Frenchtown. On August 9th, near the Wyandot village of Magwaga, Miller's force, comprising 280 regulars and more than 330 Ohio militia, find their path barred by British Major Adam Muir, with 205 British regulars, Canadian militia, and Native Americans. Miller quickly formed his men to launch an attack on the British position. As the Americans began to advance, the British unleashed a heavy fire, cutting through the American ranks and quickly halting their advance. In an attempt to launch a flanking attack on the American position, British allied Potawatomi warriors under Chief Maine Pauck moved quickly through the woods to the right of the British position. Though because of failed communication, they have not signaled their move to Major Muir, and themselves are unsure of the actual positions of the British and American lines. Spotting the warriors, the British right assumes they are Americans and soon opens fire. The Potawatomi warriors, who themselves are confused, assume they are taking fire from the actual American line and begin to return shots. The confusion will prove disastrous. By the time the Potawatomi warriors realize the mistake, they have alerted the Americans to their position, and the British continue firing relentlessly. Maine Pauck has no other option but to withdraw his men. Although outnumbering the British 3-1, the American advance has been firmly stopped in its tracks. The British position has proved far superior to the Americans, who have been taking heavy losses. To Major Muir, the American advance had begun to waver, particularly the Ohio militia. He decided to launch an all-out countercharge on the American line. Though as his force gave the signal to attack, it was quickly misinterpreted by several of his officers. Instead of ordering their men to attack, they thought the order had been to fall back. Before Major Muir knew what was happening, his entire force was in retreat. The American force, which was initially on the verge of routing, now seeing the enemy had broken, launched their own pursuit. Though Major Muir was quickly able to reform his men. Observing this, Miller, satisfied with his small victory, decided not to renew his assault and allowed the British force to withdraw. Although tactically a victory, Miller's force had suffered 18 killed and 64 wounded, while the British force had 6 killed, 21 wounded, and 2 captured. To Hull, his situation was increasingly untenable. On August 8th, he ordered the withdrawal of his force back across the river to Detroit, ending his disastrous invasion of Upper Canada. In York, British Major General Isaac Brock had begun mobilizing the province's militia. He had at his disposal only a single regiment of regulars and some small detachments of veterans and artillery. Brock was aware that there was no immediate threat from the disorganized and badly supplied American forces on the Niagara River, or from the lethargic Major General Henry Dearborn. Hull's force had attacked alone. What was initially supposed to be a coordinated, overwhelming invasion had instead resulted in a single, uncoordinated attempt, allowing the British forces, who were decisively outnumbered, to fight the Americans in detail, effectively eradicating their numerical superiority. On August 6th, Brock set out for Fort Amherstburg. Along the way, his force would swell to 330 regulars and 400 militiamen. At Amherstburg, he would be joined by Tecumseh and his roughly 600 native warriors. From there, the combined British native force was set out for the American stronghold of Detroit. In the early morning of August 15th, the British had completed the construction of a battery at Sandwich, opposite Fort Detroit. Brock orders the artillery to open fire once, to which they receive no reply. Less than an hour later, British Captain John Glegg approaches Fort Detroit under a flag of truce. He presents Hull with a letter demanding his immediate surrender, telling Hull that it is far from my inclination to join in a war of extermination, but you must be aware that the numerous body of Indians who have attached themselves to my troops will be beyond my control the minute the contest commences. Hull refused, replying, I am prepared to meet any force which may be at your disposal. The British position was strong. The battery at Sandwich consisted of one 18-pounder, two 12-pounders, and two 5.5-inch mortars. They were also supported by the guns of the provincial marine vessels General Hunter and Queen Charlotte. That next morning, under the cover of cannon fire, Tecumseh and about 600 warriors crossed the river. They were followed several hours later by Brock's contingent. Brock's original intent was to occupy a position astride the American supply line and wait for the bombardment and a shortage of food to force the Americans to surrender or attack. Though once Brock crossed, he soon became aware that a day earlier, Hull had sent a detachment of 400 men to escort a supply convoy to Detroit. Although Hull had sent messengers to recall the detachment, they had ignored the order and continued. and were now encamped about 3 miles to the south. To avoid the possibility of being caught between the two forces, Brock decided to advance immediately against the fort. With the sky lit up from the fiery orange bursts from the cannon fire, the British column begins to form a battle line, facing the west side of the fort. Meanwhile, Tecumseh's warriors have moved through the woods to the north of the fort, giving the impression of a massive contingent. Brock also ordered his militia to wear the old red tunics of the regulars, making it appear from a distance as if his force consisted entirely of professional soldiers. To Hull and the Americans, it seemed as if the bands of savages which have joined the British forces made them numerous beyond any former example. Despite his initial refusal to surrender, Hull was shaken. He was responsible not only for his soldiers, but also for hundreds of civilians. And most of all, he lacked confidence in his men. Around 10 a.m., without consulting his officers, Hull surrendered. Less than an hour later, he had agreed to give up Detroit, the Michigan Territory, and his entire command. The initial campaign had been an absolute disaster for the Americans, opening the door for the British to strike deep into the Northwest, while Brock would turn his focus back east, attempting to halt the Americans under General Stephen Van Rensselaer, culminating in the Battle of Queenston Heights.